Tuesday, July 17, 3 a.m. sharp. I know the exact time because I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand the moment it all started. I was in a sleep, heavy from the medication, when a blinding light invaded the room. It wasn't a normal light, it was as if someone had placed a spotlight from a football stadium inside our apartment. The light was golden and warm, and along with it came a heat that made the room's temperature rise by about 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. It was the exact opposite of what had happened the previous morning. If before there had been coldness and darkness, now there was intense heat and blinding light. Esperanza continued sleeping soundly, as if once again protected from witnessing what was happening to me. I tried to move, to cover my eyes to protect myself from the light, but just like the night before, my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I were paralyzed, but this time the sensation wasn't one of terror, it was one of reverence, of being in the presence of something infinitely larger and more powerful than me. From our apartment window, I could see the lights of Guadalajara, Cerro del Cuatro, twinkling in the distance, but everything looked different, as if I were seeing the world from another dimension. From within the light, I heard a voice that was completely different from the voice of the creature from the night before. This voice was soft, but at the same time, it had an authority that made my whole being tremble. It was like hearing the sound of the ocean and the wind at the same time, a harmony that seemed to come from all directions and nowhere. "Miguel," the voice said, and hearing my name being spoken like that made me cry instantly. "I need to show you your eternal destiny. I need you to see where the path you chose is taking you." I felt a strange sensation, as if I were being sucked into a giant spiritual vacuum cleaner. It was as if my soul was being separated from my physical body, pulled upward by an invisible but powerful force. I looked down and saw a body lying on the king-size bed we were still paying for in 12 monthly installments in Liverpool. Esperanza was beside me, sleeping peacefully, one of her hands extended to where I should be. The sight of my own motionless body frightened me at first, but the comforting presence of the light reassured me. It was like feeling the warmest, safest hug of my life, like when I was a child and my mom hugged me after a nightmare. To my right, a luminous figure appeared that I immediately recognized as an angel. It didn't have those little wings from a child's drawing. It was an imposing being, about 2.5 meters tall, dressed in what looked like pure light fabric. The face was serene, yet serious, and the eyes seemed to contain all the wisdom of the universe. "I am Gabriel," the angel said in a voice that echoed like heavenly music. "I was sent to accompany you on this journey. Prepare yourself for what you will see, for it will be terrible, but necessary." The angel extended one of his hands in my direction, and when I touched it, I felt an energy that coursed through my entire spiritual being. It was like touching a source of pure life, like drinking water after days in the desert. "Your body will stay here," Gabriel explained, "but your soul will travel through the spiritual dimensions to see the reality that is beyond the physical world." As I spoke, I could see through the window the entire metropolitan area of Guadalajara stretching to the horizon. The lights of Zapopan, Tlaquepaque, Tunla, glittering like jewels in the darkness. The sensation of the trip was indescribable. It was like being transported at an impossible speed, passing through layers and layers of reality that I didn't even know existed. Looking down, I saw our apartment in Torres del Bosque, getting smaller and smaller. Then the entire building, then the neighborhood. In a matter of seconds, all of Guadalajara could have been below, Plaza del Sol as a bright dot, Akron Stadium as a small circle, the San Juan de Dios River snaking through the city like a silver line. The city lights diminished as we climbed, and soon I could see the entire state of Jalisco, then all of Mexico, then North America as a small, distant continent. The sound that accompanied our journey was deafening, as if 100 planes were taking off at the same time from the Guadalajara airport. But it wasn't a disturbing sound, it was majestic, like a cosmic symphony played by instruments that don't exist on Earth. "We are passing through the spiritual atmospheric dimensions," Gabriel explained to me. places where different types of beings live and where different laws of physics apply. As we ascended through the dimensions, the temperature changed drastically. First it was hot, about 50 grams, then 100, then, until we reached a heat that should have destroyed me instantly, but which my spiritual body managed to endure. Gabriel explained to me that we were passing through the spiritual atmospheric layers, places where different types of beings live and where different laws of physics apply. Each dimension has its own temperature, its own density, its own rules, he said as we continued to ascend. What you are about to see exists in a dimension where souls who rejected God's grace remain after physical death. As we ascended, I began to see strange structures in what seemed to be empty space, as if there were invisible cities floating in the air, buildings that did not follow the laws of earthly architecture, places that seemed made of solid light or materialized darkness. It was like seeing a spiritual version of the world I had never imagined existed. After a few minutes of travel that seemed as long as an eternity as a few seconds, Gabriel told me, "Now we are going down. We are going to see the place prepared for those who deceive in the name of God." And then our direction reversed. Instead of ascending, we began descending at breakneck speed, but it wasn't a descent through physical space, it was a descent through spiritual layers, through dimensions of darkness that were becoming increasingly dense, more oppressive. The temperature began to rise again, but this time it was a dry, suffocating heat accompanied by a smell that grew stronger and stronger, sulfur mixed with something I couldn't identify, but which made my stomach churn. Gabriel gripped me more firmly. "We're getting closer," he said with a seriousness that made me tremble. "Prepare your heart for what you're about to see and remember, this is just a glimpse of what awaits those who don't truly repent of their sins." The sound of our descent changed completely. If on the climb it was like a majestic symphony, now it was as if thousands of voices were shouting at once. Not screams of anger or joy, but cries of despair, of lamentation, of a sadness so profound it cut the soul like a knife. And then, finally, we reached our journey's destination. Ahead, I saw a structure that defied description, an immense valley surrounded by mountains of black rock, with a portal at the entrance, which had signs in letters of fire. And even from a distance I could read the words that were written there. "Here burn the false anointed of 2018." Gabriel looked at me with an expression that mixed passion and seriousness. "This," he said, "is the valley of the adulterous shepherds, and if you don't change the course of your life, this will be your eternal home." The heat emanating from that place was much worse than the Guadalajara summer at 2 p.m. in May, when the temperature reaches 40 degrees and there isn't a cloud in the sky. But this heat was different. It was a heat that came from within, that burned not only the body, but the soul, that made every fiber of my spiritual being scream in pain. It was like standing at the gates of hell itself, knowing that if Gabriel weren't with me, I would already be lost forever in that place of eternal torment. The portal leading into the valley was a structure that seemed to have been carved into the very black rock of the mountain, but the fiery words that glow above it moved as if they were living creatures. "Here burn the false anointed of 2018. I read the main inscription, but as I looked more closely, I saw other, smaller phrases forming and fading in the fire. "Adulterers in the name of God, deceivers of the flock, merchants of faith." The heat emanating from that place was much worse than a Guadalajara summer at 2 p.m. in May, when the temperature reaches 40 degrees Celsius and there isn't a cloud in the sky. But this heat was different. It was a heat that came from within, burning not only the body, but the soul, making every fiber of my spiritual being scream in pain. Gabriel gripped me more firmly when he sensed I was wavering. "You need to see," he said, his voice mingling authority with compassion. "You need to understand the seriousness of the decisions you made, the lies you told, the lives you destroyed with your hypocrisy." I took a deep breath, if you can even call what we do when we're in spirit form, breathing, and prepared to enter that place that represented my worst nightmare. As soon as we passed through the portal, I was hit by a wave of sounds that nearly knocked me off my feet. They were thousands of voices shouting at once, but not cries of anger or war. They were lamentations, cries, pleas for forgiveness that echoed through the rocky walls of the valley without response. The smell was unbearable, sulfur mixed with burning flesh, sweat of agony, tears of despair. It was as if all human suffering had been concentrated in that place and transformed into a scent that penetrated the soul. The valley stretched for miles and miles, with different sections separated by rivers of fire that flowed like tributaries of a main river. Gabriel explained to me that each section was designated for a specific type of pastoral sin. Over there, he said, pointing to the left, are those who stole tithes and offerings. Over there on the right are those who sexually abused church members. And this section we're entering now, he said with deep sadness in his voice, is reserved for adulterous pastors, those who betrayed their wives and families while preaching about marital holiness and fidelity. The first thing that caught my attention were the chains. Every person in that room was chained with handcuffs that seemed to be made of solid fire, connected to heavy balls that prevented them from moving freely. The chains were not the same for everyone. Some were thicker, some thinner, some longer, some shorter. Gabriel noticed my curiosity and explained, the weight of the chains corresponds to the gravity of the sins committed and the number of lives destroyed. That one over there, he said, pointing to a man who could barely move under the weight of his handcuffs. He destroyed 15 marriages in his church, impregnated 4 married women, and still preached about the traditional family every Sunday. The man Gabriel pointed to was naked, his body covered in burns that would never heal, shouting names that sounded like women's. Sandra, forgive me. Roberta, I didn't want to. Claudia, for the love of God. It was a scene that made my stomach churn with disgust and compassion at the same time. That's when I recognized the first familiar face. It was Pastor Marcos from the Baptist Church on Lopez Mateos Avenue, a man I had known for over 10 years, who always greeted us with that big smile at pastoral conventions and conferences. He was in a somewhat secluded section, chained to a rock that radiated heat. And when he saw me, he started shouting, "Miguel, Miguel, you're here too." I knew you'd come one day. His voice was hoarse from screaming, and his face was disfigured by constant burns. "I had 5 lovers, Miguel," he screamed, struggling against the chains. 5 women from my own congregation, and I preached about sexual purity every Sunday. They trusted me, and I destroyed all of their lives. I tried to approach him, but Gabriel stopped me. "You can't touch them," he said. "No, you're still here, just an observer." Pastor Marcos continued shouting. "Their wives found out. 3 marriages were destroyed because of me. And I never truly asked for forgiveness. I always believed that God would automatically forgive me because I was a pastor." As we walked through the valley, the vision became more and more disturbing. I saw pastors from churches I knew very well, leaders who appeared on television, who they had congregations of thousands of people selling books on victorious Christian living. They were all there in different sections of the valley, paying for their sins in ways that exactly matched the evil they had caused. "That one over there," Gabriel said, pointing to a man who was being forced to carry stones of fire around. He convinced 12 women in his church that God had revealed they should separate from their husbands to stay with him. Now he eternally carries the weight of the destruction he caused. The man was exhausted, sweating blood, but every time he stopped to rest, demons appeared and forced him to continue carrying the stones. "And that woman over there," Gabriel continued, pointing to a pastor who was up to her neck in a pool of fire, "used her position to seduce the husbands of other women in the congregation. She said she had special revelations from God that she only shared in private prayer sessions. What impressed me most was the awareness that everyone knew what they were suffering from and why they were there. It wasn't like in horror movies, where people suffer without understanding why. Every pastor, every religious leader in that place knew exactly what sins they had committed. They remembered every person they had hurt, every lie they had told, every time they had used God's name to justify their carnal desires. And the worst part was that they remembered not only the sins, but also all the opportunities for repentance they had had and spurned. I could have stopped, shouted a pastor I recognized as being from a church in Zapopan. My wife found out 3 times. 3 times she forgave me and gave me another chance. But I always returned to the arms of the other women. I always believed I could deceive God as I deceived her. The tears that ran down her face seemed to turn to steam before they reached the ground. Such was the heat in that place. In one of the most distant sections of the valley, I saw an area that seemed to be reserved for the most serious cases. There were pastors who not only betrayed their wives, but also destroyed entire congregations with their scandals. Gabriel took me there, even though I tried to resist because the heat was becoming unbearable. "You need to see this," he said firmly. "You need to understand that it's not just you, but about all the people who were hurt by your hypocrisy." In that section, I saw a pastor I recognized as being from a megachurch in Tlaquepaque. He was chained in a position where he could neither sit nor lie down, forced to remain in an uncomfortable position for all eternity. He had a sandpit, Gabriel explained. 12 women he convinced were his spiritual wives. Some were married, others were single women who dreamed of getting married. He impregnated 7 of them and forced them all to have abortions so as not to tarnish the church's reputation. When the man saw us, he began to shout desperate confessions. "I killed 7 babies, 7 children who never had a chance to be born, all to protect my image as a man of God." The most terrifying part of all was realizing that this suffering had no end. It wasn't like an earthly prison where you serve your sentence and then you're released. These people were there forever, paying for decisions they made during a few decades of earthly life. "Eternity," Gabriel said, noticing my thoughts, "is much longer than the human mind can comprehend. 1 day here is equivalent to 1,000 years on earth. 1 year here is like 1,000,000 earthly years." And they remain conscious of every second, every minute, every hour that passes. I tried to imagine what it would be like to endure suffering for 1,000 years, for 1,000,000 years forever, and my mind simply couldn't process the idea. It was such a terrifying prospect that I began to shake uncontrollably. Gabriel held me firmly. "That's why you're watching this," he said, "to understand that your decisions on earth have eternal consequences. To know that there's still time to change the course of your life, but that time isn't infinite." As we walked back toward the exit portal, I saw one last scene that marked me forever, a group of shepherds who were in a circle, forced to constantly confess their sins to each other without ever receiving forgiveness. Gabriel led me to a special section of the valley I hadn't noticed before, an area enclosed by high black stone walls, where the most publicly known cases were. He said with a seriousness that made me swallow hard. "These are the pastors who caused national scandals, who destroyed the faith of millions of people, who caused God's name to be blasphemed in the media." As we drew closer, I began to hear voices that seemed familiar, voices I had heard on television programs, at conferences, and on preaching CDs circulating in the country's evangelical churches. The heat in this section was even more intense, as if the gravity of these people's sins was raising the temperature of the environment. My spiritual body was sweating a substance that wasn't quite sweat. It was as if the anguish itself was oozing out of my pores. Gabriel noticed my discomfort and said, "What you're feeling now is only a fraction of what they constantly feel. Prepare yourself because you're going to recognize many faces here." It was like walking through a museum of pastoral horror, where each exhibit was more horrifying than the last. The first pastor I recognized left me in complete shock. It was Pastor Andres of the Church of the Valley in Tlaquepaque, a man I had admired for years, who had a congregation of 10,000 members and who always preached about family and holiness. He was chained to a burning iron tree, forced to remain standing forever, never able to sit or lie down. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and despair. "Miguel," he cried, his voice hoarse from so much suffering. "You came to get me out of here, please, get me out of here." I tried to approach, but Gabriel he stopped. "He needs to finish his confession," the angel said. Pastor Andres began to speak rapidly as if he needed to vent. I had a group of 12 women, Miguel, who I convinced were my spiritual wives. Some were married, others were single and attended my church. Their tears evaporated before they touched the ground. I told them that God had revealed that polygamy was permitted for the anointed. I even seduced my own sister-in-law, my wife's sister. Her confession was interrupted by screams of pain when the hot iron touched her skin. But it wasn't just that, Pastor Andres continued, struggling against the fiery chains. I bought a 2018 Ford Lobo, 0 kilometers, 400,000, with money from the church widows. I said it was for missionary work, but I used it to take my lovers to motels. The revelation made me nauseous, and the 1,200,000 peso house I bought in Country Club was also bought with tithe money. I convinced the older brothers who were afraid of dying without leaving a spiritual inheritance to donate their savings to God's work. Pastor Andres laughed bitterly. A laugh that sounded more like crying. God's work. What a joke. The only work I was doing was building my personal empire on top of the sincere faith of those poor brothers. Gabriel explained to me that Pastor Andres was being forced to physically feel all the emotional pain he had caused his victims. Every betrayal he committed became a physical burn that never heals. Every lie he told became a chain that binds him. Every life he destroyed added more weight to the manacles he carries. It was terrible to see a man I once admired reduced to that condition of eternal suffering. Shortly after, we found Pastor Juan, whom I knew from the southern part of Guadalajara, a man who was always appearing in the local newspapers doing social work and distributing food supplies. He was in an even more terrible position, buried up to his neck in sand that looked like hot coals, only with his head sticking out, being forced to confess his crimes to anyone who passed by. When he saw us, he began to cry tears of blood. I diverted 3,400,000, he cried desperately. I have a bank account in the Cayman Islands that no one ever discovered. My wife thinks we're poor, that we live only on the church salary, but I have a hidden fortune. The hot sand was constantly swirling around her head, causing burns that healed instantly only to burst open again. I was supporting 3 parallel families, Pastor Juan continued. 3 different women in 3 different cities, each believing she was the only one. I had 9 children out of wedlock, and none of them know that I am the father. Her confession was constantly interrupted by screams of agony as the hot sand entered her mouth and nose. The next person we saw shocked me even more because she was a woman. Pastor Claudia from the American colony, a 50-year-old woman who always seemed very serious and dedicated at the women's conferences I attended. She was in a pool of boiling oil, being forced to submerge her head from time to time, controlled by demons who seemed to enjoy her suffering. I practiced witchcraft to grow the church, she cried when she managed to get her head out of the oil. She performed work in Santeria temples every Friday night, asking the saints to send more members to my congregation. The boiling oil stuck to her hair, causing pain I couldn't even imagine. And during the healing services, I used paid actors from Golado's theater, whom I hired for 1,000 pesos each to pretend they had illnesses and then pretend they were healed. Gabriel told me that Pastor Claudia was being punished for mixing the sacred with the profane, for using occult practices while preaching against them. She deceived thousands of people, causing many to spend their savings on healing offerings she knew were counterfeit. In a more secluded section, we found a group of pastors who were being forced to count money forever. Stacks and stacks of bills that caught fire as soon as they touched them, but instantly reconstituted themselves to be counted again. I recognized Pastor Renato from the Zapopan megachurch, a man who always preached about financial prosperity and who sold anointed products for the most absurd prices. Holy water for 200 pesos, he screamed when he saw me. His hands were burned by the burning money. It was tap water that I blessed for 5 seconds. Anointed oil for 500 pesos. It was cooking oil bought at Walmart. His hands shook uncontrollably as he counted the bills that crumbled between his fingers. And during the 2018 World Cup in Russia, I raised 8 million pesos, promising that if the people offered, Mexico would be world champion. Pastor Renato cried and laughed at the same time, in a state of madness that was pitiful to see. 8 million, Miguel, 8 million that I took from honest workers, housewives, retirees, promising victory that I knew I couldn't guarantee. The most outrageous case was that of a pastor I didn't know personally, but whom Gabriel told me was very famous in other regions of the country. He was in a special section, surrounded by phantom children who constantly accused him. This man, Gabriel explained with deep sadness in his voice, sexually abused dozens of children in his church for 20 years. He used his position of spiritual authority to silence the victims and their parents. The pastor was being tormented by children's voices screaming, "Why did you do that to us? Why did you hurt us? We trusted you." He tried to cover his ears, but the wives wouldn't let him. Gabriel told me that this was one of the most terrible sections of the valley, reserved for those who destroyed the innocence of children. Their suffering is proportional to the trauma they inflicted on their victims. And since the trauma of children lasts a lifetime, his punishment is also eternal and intensified. It was the most disturbing scene I had ever seen in the entire valley, and it made me understand that there are levels of evil beyond any human understanding. In another area, we saw pastors who were being forced to constantly see the consequences of their sins. They were like movie screens around them, showing families destroyed, children angry with the faith because of their fathers' scandals, wives who fell into depression, congregations that dispersed after discovering the leaders' lies. I destroyed the faith of 3,000 people. A pastor wept as he watched the images. There are members of my former church who never set foot in a church again after they discovered my double life. There are children who grew up hating God because of my bad example. The images flashed non-stop. Marriages broke down, teenagers rebelling against their parents because of disappointment in the church. Simple people who lost their faith and fell into vices and depression. This, Gabriel said, is the price of pastoral hypocrisy. It's not just personal sins, but about all the lives that are affected when a spiritual leader deceives those who trust in him. Seeing all those consequences made me understand that my sin wasn't just between Hope and me, but had ramifications that reached thousands of people who looked to me as an example of Christian living. We were walking back toward the exit portal when Gabriel suddenly stopped and looked toward a section of the valley we hadn't yet visited. It was a darker area than the others, where the fire burned a different color. It wasn't red or orange like the other sections, but a dark blue fire that seemed to suck in the light instead of producing clarity. "There's someone here you need to meet," Gabriel said with a seriousness that made me tremble. "Someone who is directly connected to your story, to your fall, to the problems you're facing." As we drew closer, I smelled a familiar scent in the air, that sweet perfume I knew so well that had attracted me so many times in the church office. But now the scent was laced with sulfur and putrefaction, creating a new combination that made my stomach churn. "It's not possible," I muttered. But deep down, I knew what I was going to find. Gabriel looked at me with an expression that mingled passion and severity. "Brace yourself," he said. "What you're about to see will explain a lot about how you got here." Then I saw her. Valentina was there, but she was no longer the pretty, delicate woman I knew. The transformation that was happening with her was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Her skin was literally melting and rebuilding, revealing something beneath that wasn't human, where once there had been smooth, clear skin. Now, red scales appeared, gleaming like polished metal. The delicate nails I had grabbed so many times were transforming into 8-inch-long claws, sharp as razor blades. Her blonde hair was falling out in clumps, revealing small horns growing from her forehead. And her eyes, my God, her eyes had turned completely red. No iris, no pupil, just a deep red that seemed to have fire behind them. The sweet perfume that always accompanied her had transformed into the most repugnant smell I had ever smelled. It was like the smell of 1,000 rotting corpses, mixed with sewage and vomit. I couldn't believe that this horrible creature was the same woman I had kissed, hugged, betrayed my family to be with her. When she saw me, a hideous smile spread across her disfigured face. It was a smile that showed teeth that had transformed into sharp fangs, teeth that dripped dark saliva that hissed when it hit the ground. "Hello, my dear Pastor Miguel," she said in a voice that was completely different from the soft voice I knew. Now it was a deep, husky voice that echoed as if coming from a deep well. "You are finally seeing my true form. You can finally meet the one who truly seduced you all these months." She tried to get closer, but she was chained with special handcuffs that they seemed to be made of a different metal than the others I had seen in the valley. Gabriel explained to me that they were specific manacles for high-ranking demons, beings who had the power to disguise themselves as humans in the earthly world. "My true name is Adultarous," said the creature that had once been Valentina. "I've been a lust demon for 2,000 years. My specialty is destroying pastors and religious leaders through sexual seduction. I was sent specifically for you in March 2018. You continued to model with that horrifying voice. "But I studied you for 3 years before I appeared at your church. I knew everything about you. Your weaknesses, your secret desires, your admiration for Joel Hostin and prosperity theology, your secret envy of pastors who had bigger churches than yours." The revelation hit me like a punch in the stomach. 3 years of studying my life, my habits, my personality, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew you were impressed by young, pretty women, that you always looked with interest when a new girl appeared at church. I built an entire false identity, especially for you. Asmodeus laughed a laugh that echoed throughout the entire valley, making other demons in the distance laugh as well. The story of being a missionary from the federal district is a lie. The psychology studies are a lie. The physical appearance, all a demonic illusion created specifically to pique your interest. "Do you want to know the truth about my academic training?" Asmodeus asked sarcastically. "I studied psychology for 3 years at the Universidad Iberoamericana, not to become a psychologist, but to better understand the minds of evangelical pastors, to know exactly which buttons to push to awaken their carnal desires." Her confession shocked me even more. I did that not as a human, but disguised as a university student. It took 3 years of attending classes, working assignments, living with humans, all to better prepare myself to destroy men like you. Gabriel told me that it was common for high-ranking demons to infiltrate human institutions to better study their victims. They spend decades preparing for a single mission of destruction, he explained. The angel. Your case was planned down to the smallest details for years. It was terrifying to know that I had been studied like an insect in a laboratory, that every aspect of my personality had been analyzed and cataloged to be used against me. Asmodeus continued his diabolical confession, clearly satisfied to reveal how he had manipulated me. "Do you think it was a coincidence that he appeared just as your church was growing, when you were feeling more powerful and confident? It was all calculated. I knew that rising pastors are more vulnerable to the temptation of pride and lust." He writhed, trying to free himself from the handcuffs, and with each movement, the red scales of his skin reflected the blue fire around him. "And the Single Christians app I used on my cell phone, you saw a few times when I was checking my phone in the office. It was real. Miguel used that app to find other victims, other single or badly married pastors who could easily be seduced." The revelation made me remember several times I had seen her checking her cell phone, always hiding the screen when someone approached. My profile was perfect, a Christian woman, educated, childless, looking for a man of God to start a blessed family. You have no idea how many pastors fell into that same trap. "Do you want to know how many pastors I destroyed before you?" Asmodeus asked with diabolical pride. 47 men who betrayed their wives, who ruined their families, who lost their ministries because of me. And you, Miguel, were number 43 on my list. She began listing names and locations with frightening precision. Pastor Antonio, de la Iglesia Bautista de la Paz, Los Angeles 2015. Hoista divorciado y trabaja como vendedor de autos. Pastor Carlos de Zapopan, 2016. His wife tried to commit suicide when she discovered the case. She is still hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic. Every name he mentioned was like a stab in my heart, because I realized it wasn't just me, it was about dozens of destroyed families, hundreds of children who lost their paternal role model, thousands of church members who lost their faith because of the scandals. Pastor Fernando.